Welcome to the Pop Cult Podcast. Here are your hosts, Ariana and Seth.
This is the Pop Cult Podcast. I'm Seth.
I'm Ariana.
And today we'll be doing an interesting double feature of movies that are both remakes of the same movie. The source movie is What Heaven Allows, directed by Douglas Sirk. And the two movies we're going to be talking about today are Todd Haynes' Far From Heaven, which will wrap up our Todd Haynes series. But first, we're going to be talking about Ali, Fear Eats the Soul, which is also kind of opening up a different series on the blog where I'm going to be writing about the German New Wave, which happened from kind of the late 60s to the early 80s, and was a period of a lot of film production in Germany. A lot of notable directors came out of it. Most people probably know Werner Herzog. They also had Wim Wenders, and then the director we're going to be talking about today in his movie is Rainer Werner Fassbinder. And so we're going to kick things off by talking about his movie, Ali, Fear Eats the Soul. This movie is about Emmy, a 60-year-old German woman who falls in love with Ali, a Moroccan immigrant who is 25 years her junior. The couple faces rejection from friends, and this puts a strain on their relationship. So to start out, Ariana, what did you think? This was the first Fassbinder movie I've ever seen, the first Fassbinder movie you've ever seen.
Yeah.
What did you think of Ali, Fear Eats the Soul?
I think it is a very well done, very well acted, very well edited film. And this is not a film that, like, immediately when you get into it, you're going to feel that way. Because we don't really get to know Emmy until she starts her relationship with, like, Ali, and it starts very randomly and very quickly.
Well, yeah, because I do like that the film opens with their meeting instead of a bunch of, like, prelude and prologue.
Yes.
It's raining outside. She slips into a cafe to get out of the rain, and it just so happens that this is a cafe frequented by a lot of Moroccan immigrants working in Germany.
And this is a film that I would not say it's a remake. It's more like influenced by the prior film mentioned, but then takes a lot of liberties with it at the end of the day.
Well, he's definitely taking the aesthetics,
yes,
and the concept, and then taking it much farther than Sirk could have taken it, making movies in America in the 50s.
And so we really don't know much about Emmy until she starts telling her story to Ali. But in comparison, we don't really know much about Ali at all. As a person.
What we know about them is in the context of their relationship with each other. And that's the whole focus of the movie.
And so this film, you can divide it within 3 different sections. The first section is the questioning of, is Ali taking advantage of her? Because he does explain at some point that that he's living in a room with 6 other people. And that, like, he lives far away from the bar, but he goes to the bar because him and his friends always go to that bar. And so she immediately allows him into her apartment, invites him to live with her. And so you're just wondering, like, is this a good setup or not? And then everyone around is remarking about the fact that, like, immigrants are taking people's jobs. They're taking advantage of these women, and so many of the women are younger than the men. And, like, there's, like, this thing of it being like that, not even old age is respected, because it's like this weird thing that it's supposed to be like she is not supposed to have any sexuality at all.
Well, I mean, like, the things that are happening in this movie feel the sad part that you're going to feel when you watch it is, oh, pretty much nothing's changed. Like in Europe or the States. Here in Europe, there's still a lot of prejudice towards dark-skinned immigrants, particularly Moroccans and Turks and things like that. I think the old age and sexuality thing in Europe has improved from what I can tell. It seems, I know in the Netherlands last year, they did a survey and they found that more seniors are engaging in sex regularly than young people, which made them a little concerned. But yeah, I think I do still think that the intergenerational relationships is still something that's probably more accepted, but still questioned.
Yeah, and then there's also like the difficulties that where her neighbors are talking about her, are excluding her from things. Her coworkers are starting to exclude her from things once they figure out the relationship that she has. She explains to Ali that, like, although she has 3 children, she doesn't see them that often because they're occupied with their own lives, which is something that is like very obvious once you move to like a place like in Europe, on how there's like this idea that you just let your parents be and go live your life and barely talk to them, kind of thing.
Well, I mean, even in the United States, that's not uncommon. Like, because of the geography of the United States, that happens often if the kids move far away. But yeah, in Europe, it's sort of, even if you do live in the same city, it's like, oh, we'll see each other when we see each other, kind of thing.
Yeah, and it's supposed to be the rejection that she feels, and how she says that at one side she's the happiest that she's ever been, but then the other side she's the loneliest she's ever been. She's a cleaning lady, so it's not as if she has like this, outstanding life compared to the film that it's based off of, where it's more of a rich woman following the lead of a more liberal-minded man. But there's just, you have that one side, and then the next part is Ali just being treated like an item. He's being fetishized because afterwards, when they take a vacation, everybody needs something from her, so they're willing to accept that she is with him.
When she volunteers him to like carry things for people without ever asking him if he wants to.
And but like when she tells him, she's like, well, if you're good to her, she'll be good to us, and they'll be good for us. But again, like you said, she volunteered him, and she never like, it's not as if she asked him and then was like in a compromising way. There's a point that he wants couscous, and she had said priorly that she liked couscous, only to be like, I don't like it, I can't cook it. I don't know why you keep mentioning it. And so you're starting to wonder, did he fall out of love with her, or did he just never love her at all? And then the third piece is, well, who are we to talk about what their relationship is if they actually have a genuine affection for one another?
It's Fassbinder kind of reminding us, you're on the outside of this.
Yeah.
So I guess you can have an opinion, but ultimately your opinion doesn't matter because it's the decision of these two people of what they want.
Yeah.
Some of the things that stood out to me, the cinematography, there are very intentional changes in the composition as the film goes on. The film opens with a lot of very fluid camera movements, kind of low mid angle when they're in the bar. It reminded me a lot of kind of like Scorsese's Mean Streets, even though I think this predates Scorsese's Mean Streets, but it's those same kind of like angles. But then once the relationship begins and the troubles start to accrue, Fassbinder begins to use the architecture of the space to trap his characters. He starts to use walls, the thresholds of doorways to kind of frame people in increasingly smaller and more confining spaces.
Yeah, through like gated windows and stuff like that.
And the intent there is to make you feel as though these people are becoming trapped inside of a thing. Yeah. And they don't really know how to get out of it. What I thought was interesting that Fassbinder would bring up with the Emmy character is very early on, he has her talking favorably about Hitler, talking about how her father was a part of the Nazi party, and even she joined the Nazi party at a certain point. And I think that's important in our modern context to think about a lot of the populist fascists that are gaining power and influence in the United States, and how there are plenty of people that see them as saintly figures. And even in the wake of a civil war or some sort of large violent clash that would depose these people, there would still be a significant chunk of the population that would have sort of a nostalgic fondness for that time. Yeah. Because she's 60 in the 1970s. We go back, 30 years? 40 years? She's a woman in her 20s and her 30s. And that's sort of, quote unquote, the prime of our life, right?
Yeah. And like she talks about, when she talked about the Hitler and being in the group, she just kind of frames it that, that was something that everybody did, and
there's nothing to be ashamed of.
But she's like, oh, but my rebellion came because I married a Polish man and my father hated all foreigners. And so it's
when she thinks that makes her like a progressive person.
Yes, but not understanding that at no point is she like, oh, I really didn't agree with it, but I was trying to survive kind of thing. And, oh, it was a terrible time, or, oh, I'm very remorseful about the things that we did, considering our neighbors.
Well, after they get married, she wants their like wedding dinner to be at an Italian restaurant that Hitler favored. Yeah. And that's her like reason for wanting to go there. Around the midway point of the movie is where this sort of crucial turn occurs. And that's where she has kind of experienced such a degree of marginalization from people that treated her kindly before that she has like an emotional breakdown. Yeah. Like she can't handle it. And I think that's important because Fassbinder is pointing out that she has now finally experienced an iota of what someone like Ali experiences, of feeling rejected, of feeling that you're outside a society that you thought you were a part of, not knowing who really are your friends. Yeah, and who aren't.
Because it's like she keeps getting rejected and rejected. Like one of the scenes is supposed to be Ali goes to the corner store, starts asking for a margarine called La Belle.
It's like a brand or something.
It's a brand. And like the guy ends up giving him a lemonade and he's like, no, it's not lemonade, it's like a butter. And
he gives him butter and he goes, it's not that.
Then they keep going back and forth to the point that Ali gets frustrated and leaves. And she goes downstairs to confront him.
Well, and before that, the grocer and I think this is his wife, have a conversation in which the grocer admits he knows exactly what the guy was looking for, but he is a racist, so he was just intentionally doing it so the guy would just leave.
Yes. And his wife was like, why did you do that? She, the wife is played very smartly, where she's just sort of like, she's not pushing too hard against her husband, but she's like, you're just creating problems for us.
Like, why would you not want to take money from someone?
Yeah. And so Emmy goes downstairs, she confronts him, and she tells him, you're only doing it because you don't like him. And Grocer is just remarking like, well, I would probably treat him better if he like knew how to speak German. And
which
the thing
he does.
He does speak German.
Just broken a little bit.
Just a little bit broken, and it's very interesting because Ali at no point speaks his native tongue.
Yeah.
The only time you hear the native tongue is through music. Mm-hmm. And there is just like these confrontations where we don't really see Ali in these confrontations very often. We only see it with the grocer.
He's not an aggressive person.
And he's not aggressive. He's played up very passive. This doesn't mean that he's a great person. There are signs that he is in like
he's cheating on
her, that he's cheated maybe on her before, or has been sexual encounters with the women that he's encountered again. But he is passive, like he's very calm, and in a way like she's like very non-threatening towards
which
Emmy.
Is a very learned immigrant trait, I think.
Yes,
because the last thing you want to do is get hassled, and you keep yourself from getting hassled by just being as invisible as possible.
Well, it's also this understanding that she is higher in the hierarchy than he is.
Mm-hmm.
So if he were to physically assault her, he would understand that would be the end of him being where he is right now. And they do have a brief discussion of like about his living situation, and she's like, why don't you find a place of your own? And he's like, there's no place that I could afford nearby. Even if I did, they would raise the prices on me.
To get rid of them, yeah.
To get rid of them. And it's like, and then in contradiction, she's having a conversation with her coworkers, trying to gauge what they think. And they're like, oh, they're stingy. They live together.
When you say they, the Moroccans.
Yes.
Yeah. That's it.
They're stingy. They live together because all they want to do is keep their own money. And then they're taking jobs from us, and they're having sex with our women. And like,
it's the same xenophobic bullshit we hear today.
Yeah. Like the things that, for example, we've heard living in the States said about Mexican, or just like,
anyone who's an outsider.
Yeah. Anyone who's an outsider, they're considered, when it's sort of like, no, they live that way because that's the only way you've allowed them to live.
Yeah. I think what's very interesting is the Fassbinder, by bringing up the Nazi Association, like if you're making a film in Germany and you're bringing up how one of your characters was a part of the Nazi party, then it's very clear that's an important element to your story and you're trying to say something about that. And if you look at the behavior of German society in the context of this movie, there is remarkably little difference between the buildup to the Holocaust and the way these people are communicating and talking and policing their own neighborhoods.
Yeah.
Because like the way her coworkers and her neighbors collude as groups and talk about her behind her back and are monitoring her comings and goings and her behavior is very similar to a lot of like secret police type stuff.
Yeah, and the thing is, like, it's mostly young men who were not alive during the time of Hitler that turn out to be like the people that don't want to get into it and are sort of like, you need to stop. Which
like
is
the apartment manager,
the landlord's son. At some point, the neighbors tell him we need to do something about it, and he's like, "That is none of my business. I'm not getting into that."
Yeah, and they're not causing trouble.
And then the police officers that come over in order to interrupt the party that they're having, but all they tell her is, "You just need to lower the music," and they're going to complain no matter what. But the neighbors are more astonished about how like passive they are, and that the neighbors are upset because they're like, well, did you see the other one with long hair? His hair's not even that long. It's just a little bit below his ear, but they no longer have that vision of the Hitler supported group of policemen. And then,
I'm sure the police in Germany are just as bad as any other police,
but
it's like they're picking their battles in a different way now.
Yeah, and it's like at least in this portrayal in this movie, the police are sort of like, we're not going to break up the party. We're just going to tell them to lower the music.
Well, because the people she gets the most pushback for are people that are close to her own generation, her own age.
And her children.
And then her adult children.
Yeah.
And her adult children, you can tell without them being explicit, they see this as a sort of like, I guess, corruption of the family name.
Yeah.
Even though they themselves are half Polish, and the movie doesn't go into it, but we can assume because her father was very unaccepting of a Polish man and his family, that her children likely experience prejudice because of their last name.
Yeah.
But it didn't seem to have any effect on developing empathy or the way they see Ali.
I mean, like, it's interesting because even in the film, the neighbors do remark about her last name.
Yeah, they do look down on her already a little bit.
Yeah,
because she married a Polish.
Like, they don't know that she married a Polish man. What they're saying, that last name, she can't. She's not an actual Russian with that,
or German,
or German with that last name, and which is like and the thing is, it's also that term that they never deem to ask her why her last name is this. In fact, when she gets married and she remarks that now her name is a new name, everybody continues to call her by her her
Polish married name.
And she never corrects them.
And I found the way this interacts with All That Heaven Allows is very interesting in that you have Douglas Sirk, who was a German who left Nazi Germany because of what was going on there, comes to America, directs what are considered women's pictures, is making movies in the 1950s about how repressive American society is in a very kind of sly way without being explicit about it, but creating stories where women are put in difficult situations where they have to choose between their, self-desires versus what this community around them is telling them they must do.
Yeah.
And so Sirk in the 50s is seeing a reflection of Nazi Germany in 1950s America.
Yeah.
So then you have Fassbinder, a fellow German, 20 years later, making movies in Germany. In this one in particular, it's a direct remake of All That Heaven Allows, that's saying things in Germany are the same that they were when Nazi Germany was in its power. And maybe it's a little less muted. People aren't getting rounded up and put on trains.
Yeah.
But the sort of deep-rooted hatred for others is alive and well in this society.
The mentality hasn't gone. It's just shifted to another marginalized group that is a little bit more obvious versus let's go down to the people who have brown hair and brown eyes because they look kind of like something that they're not.
There's another piece where in the last third of the film, she and her coworkers are back on good terms again, and they're talking about negotiating a pay raise with their employer. And they've just had, it was an immigrant, I think from Bosnia-Herzegovina, who has joined their crew and never speaks a word. So we have to assume she probably doesn't speak German. Or if she does, speaks very rudimentary German.
Yes.
And when they have a discussion about this pay raise and this sort of collective effort they're going to make, they move away from her and leave her eating her lunch and discuss it in private amongst themselves. And
like reflecting on the image when they walked away from her in the middle of lunch.
But Emmy participates, showcasing no sense of guilt, really, with these women about what they're doing. And occasionally kind of looks over and notes that the immigrant woman is over there sitting by herself, kind of sad, giving a smile, trying to be friendly as she can when she doesn't speak the language fluently. And I thought that was interesting because by the time you get to the end of Ali, Fear Eats the Soul, we have a very deep understanding of the relationship between Ali and Emmy, but it's hard to argue if she's grown. She's experienced things she's never experienced. They seem to have had some effect on her, but on the other hand, they seem to have had no effect on her. Like she has kind of compartmentalized that feeling she has at the middle of the movie and has just been like, oh, I felt that. I have let it pass through me, and I'm never going to think about it or feel that again, and I'm just moving on.
It also is, she does it because they go on vacation. They go away, and she's like, and then once we come back, like, everybody will be okay with us. And, like, I remember, like, watching the film being, like, and I looked at you, and everybody was kind of being nice before.
It was weird.
Before I picked up what was occurring, I was just like, okay, is this a dream? Because everybody was being super kind to her, only for me to realize, like, everybody wanted something from her. The grocer who comes out and greets her after she's come back from vacation when she's going to go grocery shopping elsewhere.
Which everybody we've seen before who treated her like shit is now all of a sudden super nice.
Yeah, is apologizing without having to apologize. He invites her back in after he has a conversation with his wife, who's like, she's a good customer. She pays on time. She's polite. You just need to like swallow your pride and let her come back here. It was stupid for you to cut her out. And instead of him being like, yes, you're right, he goes, oh yeah, and everybody's going to supermarkets. And like,
well, he's being reactionary. He's feeling the pressure of progress, the idea of people creating larger supermarkets that house more things and how that's pushing him out.
It's never like, he never tells his wife, you're right. He goes, ooh, supermarket.
But and it's one of those instances where, hey, have you noticed this growing population of non-Germans in your community? Maybe court them as customers and that might help you. But he doesn't think about that at all.
Then it's the neighbor whose son is like taken away over to Norway at last minute and she needs to keep all his stuff. And since
there's like a basement space everybody has in the apartment.
And since Emmy has the most space there, she's asking her like, hey, can you lend me some of that space? And Emmy agrees to that. And that's when she sends Ali downstairs to go clean up.
If you think about the dynamics of hierarchy in this movie, Emmy starts out, presumably before we really see her, as just kind of baseline in the middle. She's someone nobody takes note of, really. Yeah,
they kind of like when she goes into the bar, people are kind of like,
she's just a person.
She's a person, but when she goes into the bar, she is looked less than because she's not young.
People like her don't come to the bar.
She's not attractive.
So there's the ageism that comes from the people in Ali's circles towards her. But the film is very clear in letting us know that the racism is far worse than the age.
Yeah, and so like Ali embracing her, having her dance, he walks her home, and that is like before the relationship starts.
But the hierarchy piece, so we could say she's just kind of a baseline German when the movie starts. Once she is deeply devoted to Ali and their relationship, her status in the hierarchy plummets to the point that she's seen as just slightly better than someone like him.
Yeah.
And even then, that's where you talk about the questioning of her married name. Is she even a German, right?
Yeah.
But then there's that switch after the honeymoon where her status changes remarkably to the point that it's higher than it was when it started in the movie.
Yeah.
But I think part of what's going on there is she has also dismissed Ali as an equal. When they were dating, when they were living together, as they were getting married, she showed slightly more respect towards him as someone like who was deserving of the same dignity that she would give to anyone else, right? And that's what's so interesting to me is he's become like a servant to her. We see that with the whole moving things in the basement, where it's his choice, his consent, what he would like to do is secondary now.
Well, now he's basically treated as the way that women would are treated at times when they get married. Because their marriage, even like, it is not as if Ali asked her to marry him. It's not as if she asked him to marry him.
She lies to someone.
What happens is the landlord's son comes in and is like, hey, you're not supposed to have like a tenant in here. He needs to leave immediately. She gets scared and without thinking says, but we are going to get married. Like, he is going to be my husband. And Ali, who's having breakfast, wasn't really listening to the conversation because, again, like, his German isn't that strong and they're talking really fast. She tells him, embarrassed, I told them that we got married.
Or that we're getting married.
That we're getting married. And Ali's like, okay, we should get married. That sounds good.
Yeah, and like you were saying before, you're not sure, is Ali just kind of riding this gravy train for as long as it goes, or does he genuinely love her? And I feel like I think he does love her.
I think he does love her, but the novelty starts to wear off a little bit because he doesn't know where his happiness is. Because before they leave, they're like married for like 3 months. And it's supposed to be during the 3 months we see like the downfall between like the neighbors not treating her right.
Her
kids, like, one of them broke like her television set in anger.
The corner store. And
then later on, if she's supposed to cover a shift for somebody, they discover that she has a Moroccan husband. He's in a robe. She gets offended and goes, well, I'm just going to ask someone else.
Yep.
And like, also the funny thing is once everybody starts being nice to her, there's also that thing of like when she encounters her coworkers again, turns out one of their coworkers had been stealing, which had the coworker that participated in.
Well, she was. I think it was the same coworker that was talking about how the Moroccans are just a bunch of thieves who take from us.
Yeah,
and it turns out this native German is the one stealing from her business.
Like how then they try to justify like their dislike towards this new woman by being like, she's always so shifty. She never seemed to settle.
Well,
and it's like,
if you think about it, how many people in Emmy's social circle acknowledge Ali in that second part of the movie?
It's like
he's invisible. He's invisible to them.
Like her coworkers come to like organize what they're going to say to their employer, only for him to be on display, and she just prompts them.
He's
to
an
touch
ornament
him because they're like, oh, he's so. They're like, they tell him like, oh, they didn't think he was going to be that clean, and she's like, yeah, he showers every day. And they're like,
she joins in and dehumanizing him.
And she's like, oh yeah, come over and touch him, and he's flexing his muscles, and for a brief few seconds he's amused until he starts to realize like
it reviles him.
He's like, oh, I'm just a toy. Like, I am not a person to them. And like, you feel sad for Ali because it's like she's trying in her way when she like encourages like his friends to come over to have a drink. She's trying to appease him, but she's trying to appease him in the way that she would any other person, like any other man, thinking, well, if I let him drink, it'll be fine. If I bring him over with his friends, it'll be fine. If I let him cheat on me, it'll be fine. But it's like never, there's that thing that we're starting to realize is they never have a conversation about what's occurring. They have a conversation about being in love. They have a conversation about their past, but they never have a conversation about their future.
Yep. But yeah, and then Fassbinder himself is such an interesting guy. He was a bisexual man. He died very young in his, I think, early mid-30s of a drug overdose. I think it was cocaine and barbiturates. And he was actually in a sexual relationship with the actor playing Ali, El Hedi Ben Salem. And that was a very interesting thing that I read about, where Salem abandoned his wife and children after he met Fassbinder at a like sauna in Paris.
Yeah.
moved with Fassbinder to Germany, where Fassbinder's from, starred in some movies, but was also a very tumultuous relationship due to drugs and alcohol, a lot of domestic abuse. 3 years after Ali Fear Eats the Soul was made, Salam ended up in prison, I believe, and then hung himself to death.
Yeah.
And then about a decade later or so, Fassbinder would die of a drug overdose.
And it wasn't that his friends like hid his death.
They hid Salam's death from Fassbinder because for years because they knew it would like emotionally and psychologically break him to hear about this. And so it is interesting because this was the first Fassbinder movie I've ever seen in my life, you as well.
Yeah.
And it makes me very interesting because I think in our German New Wave series that we'll be doing on the blog, I think there's going to be 2 or 3 more Fassbinder movies we'll be watching. He also did a TV series in Germany that I am blanking on the name of right now. But it's something that I do want to watch in the future. And what was interesting is he was a very controversial figure, no surprise, in German media at the time. And they actually moved the airing of the show back to a later time out of fear that children might come across it, because he was very open about his sexuality and pushing the boundaries of what was acceptable in German culture. And just one of those very kind of tragic, chaotic, but still fascinating kind of figures in film. And we're back. We'll be talking now about yet another remake of Douglas Sirk's All That Heaven Allows, and this time it is Todd Haynes' Far From Heaven. Came out in 2002. It was the first Haynes movie to get a lot of recognition on the awards circuit, and it is a story which crosses both sexual and racial lines, revolving around a privileged suburban family whose lives are filled with daily family etiquette, social events at the club, and an overall desire to keep up with the Joneses. The family is turned upside down when both the husband and wife are faced with choices that not only create a gossip mill for the entire community, but also change their entire lives forever. So much, it hews much closer to Far From Heaven's plot, with some very notable variations in that the husband is still alive.
Wait, what was the name of the original film?
Far From Heaven. Or, sorry, All That Heaven Allows.
Okay.
Yeah,
It's just
yeah.
too
They're
titles.
so close. So All That Heaven Allows, the husband is dead in that film, which makes it that she's getting involved with other men is something that's kind of acceptable. She'd be looking for another husband. In this instance, her husband is very alive. They have 2 children together, and Haynes folds in his own experiences as a gay man, but also doesn't elevate his status as gay to be equal to or higher than some of the other prejudices being faced in the movie. And we'll get into what that means. First, Ariana, what did you think of Far From Heaven? This is the 4th Todd Haynes movie in a row that you've watched.
It just makes me feel like I'm a Todd Haynes fan, especially when he has.
Because I know you'd seen Carol before, and I know you didn't care for that as much.
I thought it was an okay film, but it's one of those films that, like, as I was coming back to finish this recording, I was just like, I think I might have liked it better had Julianne Moore been even.
So instead of Kate, because Kate Blanchett's good,
she's very good at it.
For me, Carol, the problem, Rooney Mara. I think Rooney Mara is uncharismatic.
Yeah,
and I think that's the problem. But that's a discussion for a different time.
Stoic. Anyway.
But you really, Todd Haynes plus Julianne Moore, you're just like gold.
They have an understanding of each other. He knows what to ask from her, and like again, this is a tidbit of an interview that has always stuck with me about her when somebody was like, "You're such an amazing actress," and she's like, I'm only as good as the director allows me to be, because like she's like, I don't do well if the director doesn't give me anything. And
which is true. I've seen performances from her that are terrible, but then you look at like the people who directed them, and they're people who don't have a lot of experience or just kind of make bad movies
or like aren't comfortable. And she's like, with him, it is like full on. I believed her that she was this person.
Yeah, you forget it's her.
Yeah, and so it's the interesting thing is like at the beginning of the film, everything feels very like tight.
It feels exactly the way a Sirk film feels.
Yes.
Like aesthetically, the way the characters are talking, it's a very formalized English.
Yeah.
In
And
that
like,
we talk to each other in a very clear way.
yes.
So but I think that's intentional. I think we're meant to feel how false that is.
Yeah.
Because there's a moment in the movie, and I think I pointed out when we were watching it, and I said to you, I said, oh, reality just cracked through.
Yeah.
And it's when Dennis Quaid, who plays, so we have Kathy Whitaker as Julianne Moore's character, and she's married to Frank, played by Dennis Quaid. And it's a scene where they come out of a doctor's office, and he turns to her, and I had to go find the quote. It's nothing too complex, but just the way he delivers it, and especially the way the film has been going up to this point, when he just says, I just want to get this fucking thing over with. And it's the first instance in the movie where anyone has dropped an F-bomb.
Yeah.
Up until this point, even when he would get mad or she would get mad, there was still there was a wall. There was a restraint that we can't get that mad. And he finally snaps. Mm-hmm. And it's a chilling moment. And you can see it on her face. That she's stunned that he would use this kind of language.
Well, it's also because it's like, oh, he broke the script, so she doesn't know what her response is supposed to be. And she's constantly docile until it comes to what her beliefs are. And so, like, during it, we're watching her just fix up the house, being all over the place. She has a Black maid played by Viola Davis, who's not really like used very.
I think early Viola Davis like role in a movie of this scale.
Yeah, and so like if you're expecting by hearing her name, she's not really used that much in the film.
Still very good, and the performance calls for subtlety because it's once again we're in a world where nobody's talking about how constrained everyone is.
Yeah,
and as a Black woman working in a house for white people like this, she is walking a tightrope every day.
There's like the thing is she's so good at giving concerned looks.
Yes, she doesn't have a lot of dialogue, but and it's the sign to me of always, if someone's a good actor, how do they react? Is it over the top? Is it subtle? Have they found that like perfect middle ground where like how that character feels, and she nails it when the camera cuts to her, and you can tell she would like to say something, but she's not going to say anything.
Kathy is being interviewed by a reporter about just like daily life. And
she and her husband are the face of an appliance company, I think. That's where her husband works.
Where he works, and he's probably one of the top people.
And it's like a Don Draper ad guy. And so he made her and him the face of the company. They're the family of whatever it is. Yes. Yeah.
And they're discussing about how she organizes like different events, parties, how she's always on the pulse of what the community's doing. And she notices somebody in her backyard.
A black man.
And she, instead of having like Sybil like go out, she goes to check.
Well, that seems interesting because the reporter who's there with a camera person, I think mentioned something about, should we call the police?
Yeah.
And Kathy, she's not being that open-minded because she's still upset that there's a black man in her yard, but she's being more independent-minded and goes out to basically ask him what he's doing.
Yeah, she told him like there's no need to call the police, and she gets up and goes to talk to him, and it turns out to be Raymond Deegan, because his father used to own. His
father was the landscaper for the property previously.
For the property,
which is directly from All That Heaven Allows.
Exactly. Yeah. And they have a brief conversation, and I think like there is this flirty nature that he's conveying to Kathy in a way that Kathy doesn't respond to, but we don't get like really deep into it until maybe like the second time that they meet.
Well, he's a very effortlessly charismatic person. Yes. He's just a nice person to talk to.
Yeah, it's the second time that you're like, oh, he is flirty, and the only reason we know this is because again, Sybil is there.
And he's the first character that talks to her who doesn't sound like he's reading from a script.
Yes.
He's definitely following a social order that he's aware of, but he's found a way to be himself within that bubble.
Yeah, and so I think it's supposed to be the scene where she loses her scarf. She goes back and he happens to have it. And as Sybil goes outside, again, Viola Davis, she's like saying something that she has to do, and she just gives him a look.
Like a watch your ass, man.
Because she's just sort of like
you know better than this, black man. You do not get involved with these white people.
But I do love the fact that Sybil at no point is like telling like Kathy that she should not get into this with him.
She also knows if she were to do that, she would be held in insubordination or something.
Yeah,
right? So she's like, if these white people want to drive their car off a cliff, let them. Like, as long as I get my paycheck.
But it's such an interesting film because there's little tidbits that you can pick up about.
Well, there's 3 specific forms of prejudice that are presented in the film.
Yeah,
you've got racism, you've got sexism because she's a woman, and then you have homophobia as part of it. Because I don't think this is really a spoiler. If you see the trailer, you can pretty much understand what's being implied. Frank is a closeted gay man.
Yeah.
And there comes a moment where he's going to be late home for dinner. He's telling her he's working at the office. He's actually hooking up with someone he met at a gay bar. And Kathy comes to bring him his dinner and walks in on a man going down on her husband.
No, they're making out.
That's what it is. Yeah. And so she's horrified.
Dennis Quaid would not allow that.
Yeah. And so Frank he talks to her afterwards, and it's kind of, oh, I'm so sorry. This is a horrible thing I've been struggling with, and I'll get help for it. And he does. Like, they go to see a doctor, played by the great character actor James Rebhorn, who...
Yeah, I mean, he's not the one that offers to go to a doctor. She asks him, is there a doctor you can go to? Because it's just
at the time it was viewed as a mental health issue.
Yeah,
right?
and the way that he words it to her is a mental health issue, and that he never really sought out help before, but he's always struggled with it, which is more along the lines of him being like, I just thought I could just fuck around and keep a wife and kids.
Well, and that's the thing. The only reason he's agreeing to go to the doctor is he's like, well, I've gotten caught, so I have to do something.
Yes.
And that's where we get that line of when they come out of the doctor's office with this sort of plan in place, and she's kind of talking about, oh, yes, and she wants to keep talking about it. And that's when he says, I just want to get this fucking thing over with.
Yeah, it's the sad thing because she's trying to be excited for him.
And supportive.
Like, she's like, oh, because she's not involved in the conversation with the doctor. The doctor
excuses her from the room. Which is sexism right there.
And I think it's also like this weird thing of also being like, well, I'm going to ask Frank some questions about his sex life that you're not going to be happy with.
Or also that what's happening in that room is an honest conversation where a doctor is going, well, you have to suppress this. It doesn't matter that that's who you are. Yeah, in our society, you just don't get to be that kind of a thing. The
conversation is actually the doctor going, are you sure you want to go along with this?
Yeah.
Like, he's not saying that homosexuality is good, but he's sort of like,
you're going to hurt yourself doing this.
Like, do you understand what you are going to proceed with? And Frank kind of accepts it. And poor Kathy, who's like, oh, isn't Dr. Bowman like really a nice guy? He seems really great. And that's when he snaps at her.
And that's where like the facade of the world crumbles after that moment. Whenever people start to see Kathy being very chummy with Raymond, which she runs into him in town, they meet up on purpose at certain points. But there's always someone who happens to be in the background observing, very much like in Ali, Fear of the Soul, where she can't really have a relationship with Ali without being under the watch of the community.
Yeah.
The same thing with Kathy here. And she has a best friend, Eleanor, played by Patricia Clarkson, who feels like she stepped out of a Douglas Sirk movie. Like you could send her back in time, put her in one of those movies, and she would not stand out. No, she fits so, like, her cadence, her mannerisms, it's just so perfect.
The thing is, like, they have her with the signature red hair, same as the friend, and
the clothing and everything.
Yeah. So it's this interesting, like, dynamic, especially because it comes right from the other film when she's like, Kathy, I am your dearest, most best friend in the whole world. You can tell me anything.
And when you're like, don't tell her anything, this would be a bet. And she's not like a horrible friend. She's just a conformist. She is going with what is accepted of the times and wants to protect her friend from being hurt.
She isn't like, the character that she's based off of, what was the other film's name? Like now I'm getting confused.
From All That Heaven Allows.
All That Heaven Allows, because at some point that best friend character relents and goes, "Well, it's my bad. I shouldn't have told you, but I was trying to protect you."
This movie is far bleaker than All That Heaven Allows.
It's like this. So the sexism that comes between like her not being allowed in the doctor's office. There's also
the sexism is her attempting to determine the trajectory of her own life is considered absurd.
Yeah.
That you would need a white man in the driver's seat to tell you what you're going to do. Because by the end of the film, Frank has decided to embrace his homosexuality, which involves leaving his family, in which she's being very amicable for that time period of sort of, I'm just okay. But the idea is Todd Haynes, which is interesting because remember, he is a gay man, is pointing out that Frank's situation is not as bad as Raymond's situation. That Frank, because he's still white and male, can hide his homosexuality. She can't hide she's a woman. Raymond can't hide he's black.
Yeah, because it becomes obvious towards the film that, yes, they are getting a divorce, but Frank is just basically going to give her money to survive, to have her keep the name, and that like she would raise the kids.
Yeah, he's just
and that like
disengaging from it all.
That he will just come visit occasionally, and it's like this weird thing is like the kids don't know that they're divorced.
Yeah, but when the movie ends, we don't see the children react to this knowledge.
So I think what it is that the whole community is going to assume that they're still married, but he's off doing business.
They're just going to live an even worse lie than they're already living.
And so when Frank comes home sort of distraught, he's distraught. There's several times he's distraught.
Well, not just distraught, he falls into alcoholism.
Yeah, he gets in a rage when he finds out that Kathy's been hanging out with Raymond because someone saw him, like Mona saw them together, and she's like
the town gossip.
The town gossip, and so everybody knows, and he's mad at her. And there is a moment that you can see Kathy wanting to be like, "But you're gay."
Yeah, so like, who the fuck are you?
She's
that filter's still there.
That she's sort of like. And she's sort of like, "But what about you?" And he's sort of like, she's like, "This isn't about us. This has to do with something more. That's why you're yelling at me."
Mm-hmm.
And
because she's doing something that doesn't help him keep up the facade.
Yeah. And so like later on, when he does confess to her, he's like teary-eyed, he's sobbing, he's like having this whole moment where he's telling her like, "I fall in love with someone and this person wants to be with me." And there's like that cry of relief for himself.
Because it's one of those where you would think in a Haynes movie, this scene would be framed as, wow, Frank is, when you go back to something like Velvet Goldmine with Christian Bale's character, it's like, oh, he's accepted himself and he's free. But Haynes goes, yeah, that's great for Frank. What about his wife? Yeah. What about everyone else that he's damaged? Like, what responsibility does he have to them?
So he's like, and I think I want to pursue this. So he confesses to Kathy because what he wants is for her to play the villain, for her to shout at him and tell him, "You can't leave your children," to threaten him.
And she never does.
And she doesn't. She just mumbles, "Well, I think we should get a divorce then."
She's like so... Like, it's a movie about a woman who is so passive that it breaks your heart at the end of the movie. And it's
like, and the funny thing is, before his confession, there is that point of sexism that's even embedded into their son. So Frank is there nursing a glass, and the kid comes in and he's like, "Hey, Dad." And she's like, "Hey, your dad's really busy with work. I need you to go upstairs, get washed ready for dinner, and then you'll talk to your dad later." He dismisses his mom to start talking to his dad until the dad is like, "Mind your mother."
Yeah.
And it's just like, this is...
It's just sort of what I don't understand, like what... Because her future would be, if they get a divorce, she has to marry another well-to-do white man, because how is she going to survive without that, right?
And I think what it is like he's financially just going to take care of them.
And she'll just meant to be an old maid for the rest of her life, I guess.
Yeah. Like, the sad thing is, like, at the least with All That Heaven Allows, there is... You could understand, like, her children are older, so she doesn't have that huge responsibility for them. Well, she is willing to sacrifice for them.
It's the parallel is in All That Heaven Allows, at the end of the movie, her children basically abandon her, which sucks, but she does end up with Rock Hudson, right?
Yeah.
However, in this movie, it's her husband who abandons her, and the man she's in love with, Raymond, leaves town because of the growing hostility towards him, not just by the white community, but his own black community, who see him as creating a potential threat for all of them by being around this white woman so much.
Yeah, and it's like that interesting thing that, like, so at one point during the film, the kid is talking to his dad to be like, hey dad, if I found out like these two, like because the dad had been away for like, they came back from vacation after like,
well, that's where Frank meets his new lover.
Yeah,
he appears to be like the son of a wealthy family on the same cruise or something.
Yeah, I think they're in Miami.
You're right.
And they're like, oh well, dad, these two kids got like
they beat up a black girl.
They're like, they beat up a girl and they got like, what's the word? It's X. It's like EX. Not suspended. Like they were just like kicked out of school. I forgot.
It rarely ever happens anymore.
But they had a discussion about it, and they're like, oh, and they're like a little black girl, because again, their school probably was only white kids.
Yeah.
And it's like, so and it is like Raymond's daughter, but
Kathy doesn't know that. Yeah.
So it's not until I think Sybil hears that Kathy calls the NAACP to like donate her time and volunteer, because she had people come to the door at some point, but she told Sybil to just fill out her information.
Well, that's one thing throughout the movie where her neighbors know her as like, oh, she's very sympathetic towards the Negroes.
Yeah,
but it's seen as like, oh, how silly of her.
And like, it's also the silliness that she's thought about when she shows like empathy and sympathy towards gay people. When she has that conversation with Eleanor about it, because Eleanor's like, really, at first the black people and now like gay men.
I think Moore does such a good job of portraying someone who we can't hold them to the same standard of sort of progressive thought that we might somebody in a contemporary context, because the level of knowledge that this woman would have had about these things would be almost non-existent. But Haynes wants us to understand that the fact that there's even this little spark in her of this is admirable. It is crazy that she would even think this way at this time.
She speaks it out because she's like there with the pamphlets asking to donate her time, and that's when Sybil like tells her, I didn't want to tell you this because it was like, I felt like it was crossing a barrier, but I wanted you to know that it was Raymond's daughter that got attacked. And so Kathy rushes over to double check on how Raymond's doing. And that's when Raymond explains that they've been barely sleeping because there's been rocks hitting the roof and the windows of the house. And she's like, oh, is it white people? And he's like, surprisingly enough, it is the black community that's coming after me because they see me spending time with them.
And it makes sense because they think, oh, if this goes sour, then they'll come for all of us.
Yeah.
And he's endangering all of us by doing
this.
This.
So he explains to her that within like 2 weeks he's going to be moving because his business isn't doing well.
Protect his daughter.
And he needs to protect his daughter. That even though there was a spark of understanding and maybe he was falling in love with her, and I think he definitely was, he just understands that it's not going to happen and that it's not like good. And like then the next scene is you hear her just wailing on the bed, just crying alone
because Frank's gone. Raymond's leaving. She has no one.
She has no one, and she is just like buried in her solitude because at some point when she does express to Eleanor, who's supposed to be her best friend, about what Frank has done and how with Raymond she feels like she can be her own person and that she feels excited about life, is that when Eleanor just turns her back towards her.
Well, it's a culture that's familiar to me. I think growing up in the South, it's that culture of when you need to have a serious conversation about something that's very serious and important, well, I don't want to hear that right now, or it's not time to talk about that. But the thing is, those types of people will never have those conversations with you ever because, and I think this is so crucial to what this film is about, is it's the reason why he didn't just pick one type of prejudice and make the movie about that. He picked 3 of the most dominant forms of prejudice in Western culture and it also ties into the fact that Haynes is such a stylist. like from his short film about Karen Carpenter through like Poison and Safe and Velvet Goldmine. He stylizes his movies to an extreme degree. And this movie is also stylized. You might not feel that it's as extreme because the style that it's aping is a style of sort of mutedness. Mm-hmm. But what he's attempting to do is use this style as an element of the plot, that you people live in a fantasia. When you are white, when you are economically well-to-do, you live in a fantasia in America. You live in a world that is not real. And the only reason you might argue against that is for one clear thing. You've never stepped out of line. And I think Haynes would go, yeah, step out of line with where you think you're supposed to belong and see what happens. Look at Ali, Fear Eats the Soul. The minute she steps out of line with the expectations of her community, she is evil to them. Yeah. She is unwanted. She is dirty. She is unclean. And so Haynes uses these sort of like absurdly perfect New England autumn visions, the fashions, the makeup, the lighting, to hide the horror. And by the end of the movie, we see the scale of the horror for someone like Kathy, that she is alone. And he refuses to give her a happy ending, which I think is the correct route to go.
Yeah, it is the correct route. And it does.
Which was the route Sirk originally wanted to go with Far From or All That Heaven Allows, was that Rock Hudson dies in his original concept of that movie. But the studio was like, well, you got to make it a happy ending.
Well, it's like that understanding. And this is coming from someone like, I don't mind happy endings. A lot of times I wish for happy endings, but is also ultimately understandable if you're going to depict this as close to reality as possible, but you're going to give me these facades of like these beautiful autumn days, you know, golden leaves in front of the camera, like beautiful shots with like perfect lighting. I'm going to be fine with the fact that there's this sadness that goes with it, because at the end, within the 2 weeks, she goes over to the train to say goodbye to Raymond.
And she sees him.
And she sees him. And the thing is, like, you are reminded that she did plead with him at some point. She told him, we can move. People don't need to know who we are. Mm-hmm. But he's like, it's never going to be enough no matter where we are. We're going to confront this.
We're in America.
Yeah.
Like,
and
where do you think you can go and be in a relationship with a black man in the 1950s?
Understanding that beyond the fact that had she been able to do that, they would be sacrificing ultimately their own children into the fire, whether they wanted to admit it or not, because to bring two white kids to be raised by a black man and then a black little girl raised by a white woman would have resulted within chaos. And all she's going to have to do is live with the memory and like the dreaming of the what if of someone who viewed her in a certain way and spoke to her in a certain way, and that she could be as bold as she was. Like, for example, when she's sitting with him and they're listening to music and he was like, kind of like, do you want to leave? And she's like, no, I want you to ask me to dance, which is a forward response for someone like her.
It goes back to whenever she confronted him in the garden when they were like, oh, we should call the police. Yeah. It speaks, that's where the sexism is she is a woman who is perfectly capable of handling herself and her life, but she lives in a society that's told her she's not allowed to.
And so at the, like, before the ending of it, when she's like writing a check to make sure that everything's paid for, and she's asking Sybil, like, hey, you don't have to work as hard, kind of like, I think she's trying to like pinch pennies so Frank
cut her hours, yeah.
Or like also just make sure that like Frank doesn't like take away money from them and be able to pay certain things. Sybil has become her only ally because her best friends are gone. The community, we don't know what's happening.
And Sybil's her only ally because she pays Sybil to be there. Because if you don't pay Sybil, there's no reason for Sybil to come around.
But Sybil's like, I want to do this. Yeah. Like your house, I want your house to look pristine. Because I think it's like this sense of pride that she worked with this woman and continues to work with
and because I think that's something you commonly see is that oftentimes, and it's not universal, but oftentimes I've noticed black people have far deeper empathy for white people suffering than white people have for other white people suffering. Time and time again, I have seen this in real life, in the media. It is a very commonly known thing that nobody talks about that much. But like when it comes to like disabled white people, the first people they're caring for protecting them, speaking up for them, people of color.
Yeah.
Gay people, even though the gay movement often kind of gets co-opted by white voices, people of color are some of the most prominent and important voices in the gay movement.
They would not have the rights that
Yeah,
they had
they
today
wouldn't.
have not been for like black and brown bodies laying their lives on the line for them.
And so I love it that someone like Haynes, this white male director, who he doesn't overtly talk about race in a lot of his work, but one thing I've noted is he always tries to find a way to put black actors in roles in his work, even if they're not major roles. Like in Safe, there's that one black actress who's at the compound with Julianne Moore's character.
Like the second in command or third in command.
There's a black member of Brian Slade's entourage in Velvet Goldmine. And then here he's able to be most overt because the film allows him to be, is he's talking directly for the first time about racism, but he's also not afraid to do a comparison with what it means to be queer in a society like this. What does it mean to be black in this society? What does it mean to be a woman? And how these things intersect, and how certain people like Frank comes out on top purely because he's white male, and that's why his queerness is able to be hidden so well, is he's in the dominant position. I was thinking when we talk about I think we're right. I don't think it should be sad or happy endings. I think it should be authentic and inauthentic endings.
Yeah.
And I think this movie has a very authentic ending. It doesn't sell you an ending that it didn't earn. It doesn't try to placate the audience or talk down to you. It simply presents to you, and now that we're done with all of the glamour and the stylization, where is this woman left at the end of the day? And it's alone.
Yeah.
To walk home alone from the train station to an empty house.
Or just she was in the car, and at the end of the day, she never tells her children why she's there.
Yeah, and she just she has no one to even confide this in.
Yeah, so it's going to be a secret that she's going to hold to herself, because at the end of the day, if she spills it out to them, what benefit do they have from it?
And so all the shitty people around her who talked down to her, discouraged her, there is no consequence for them. And that's where a film like The Help, I find, though people will talk about, it's a very empowering film, we need that, right? For me, my personal preference is always a movie that's going to deliver an authentic story to me. And the authenticity of America during this time period is, if you weren't a white guy, you were fucked.
Well, with The Help, unfortunately, it's going through the guise of talking about black women's lives through like the voice of a white narrator at the end of the day.
And I think in this movie, he never tries to tell you Raymond's story, because he knows, I can't tell you Raymond's story. I can tell you Kathy's story because, and I think it's one of the funny things, he's like, I relate to Kathy because I am a homosexual in America, and I find I can relate a lot more to her status than someone like Frank, who's willing to lie about who he is, who's willing to use substances to like fake his appearance to people. He's like, I relate to Kathy because I know who I am and I know what I believe in, and it's so hard to live in this society like that.
Well, like he can relate to her in association of both being white people that are oppressed in their own ways. He can relate to Frank because they're both white and gay. He can't relate to Raymond because that is a straight black man.
But I think he ultimately knows that Raymond's the one who's the worst off in this situation.
Yeah.
Like, he has to uproot his entire life from the town he grew up in. No one else is having to do that. But as we reflect back on Far From Heaven, Ali, Fear Eats the Soul, and All That Heaven Allows, the original one.
Yeah.
Of those three, which one do you feel is the standout for you that you would recommend? Because it's one of those where nobody has to watch all three of them to appreciate even one of them. So where would you direct someone to go out of those three?
Far From Heaven is obviously going to be more relatable if you grew up in the States. But Ali, Fear Eats the Soul, I think is still very good and something you can learn from. So it's hard for me to separate those two just because they're so strong in their own ways. And they are remarking on something about a generation like being raised, like with Ali, it's sort of like being raised by people who participated in the Nazi
in the Holocaust, yeah.
And then like them being your grandparents or your parents, versus Far From Heaven is like a movie that like anyone in anyone else's hands would end up with this oddly happy ending that you knew like that would have brought a lot of heartache at the end of the day.
They try to make it bittersweet or something. Yeah.
But it ultimately is something that needs to be viewed and talked about. So.
Yeah, I would go with Far From Heaven, just because I think Haynes is such a strong visual director in tandem with being such a great director of actors.
Yeah.
That the two things together just result in a movie that, even though it's 21 years old now, still feels very relevant. Sadly, feels like not much has changed.
Yeah.
And that these are still problems that American and Western society need to deal with. All right, and this is our pop cult picks for the week. This is where we share just real quickly something in pop culture that stood out to us over the last week. So, Ariana, what is your pop cult pick?
The only reason I pause is because this album is almost 2 years old, but you know,
it doesn't matter. It's whatever. I talked about a comic that's from 1989, so you're fine.
It is Julian Baker's Little Oblivions, an album that she released again in 2021. So if you're really into sad lesbian music, and I'm allowed to say this because she's an actual lesbian.
But is she sad though?
It's very sad. The saddest that ever been. You should listen to it.
The Saddest Little Lesbian. That's that should be a book. I'm going to recommend something that most of you probably can't get to, which is the Eye Film Museum in Amsterdam, Netherlands. We recently visited the museum. It's part of the Eye Film Institute, which is a larger organization that includes a film archive, museum, and actual cinema. And they preserve a lot of Dutch language films, but also foreign films. And like any museum, they have a rotating exhibit and also a permanent exhibit. It's a very easy place to get to. It's a free ferry ride from the Amsterdam Central Station, which if you're going to Amsterdam, that's probably how you're going to show up there. You just hop on a ferry, takes you all of 5 minutes to get across the water. You walk to the museum. I think for the tickets, it was maybe about 13 euros a piece.
Yep.
And it was our first time there, and it was very easy to get to. And the permanent exhibit was interesting. They had a lot of historical cameras and projectors, which were interesting to look at. They also had some interactive exhibits. I think a lot of it aimed towards children or older children.
Yeah.
There was a little pods where you can watch scenes from movies and they quiz you. There's a green screen activity where they put you inside of a short film. There was a really interesting room where they had tablet computers that could interact with images on the wall. And you could either cast themes onto the wall, and it might be blue. Well, you throw that at the wall from the tablet, and all of a sudden it's all these blue images. Then you can catch, which is you aim at one of the images, and then it'll tell you about the movie being featured on the tablet, which is pretty cool. We went and saw the rotating exhibit, and I'm sad that I don't have her name written down right now, but she was I believe a Kazakhstanian filmmaker and artist, fairly young, who does a lot of experimental work and installations about the experience of being a Kazakh person and the way their language has been warped and changed over time. That was a big part of the exhibit.
It talked about the Soviet Union coming in and taking over, which people sometimes dismiss when they talk about it, because it was colonization.
I mean, because it was coming in and imposing a language and a whole system on them that they didn't necessarily ask for. And it was very interesting, and it made me interested to see other exhibitions as they come in. With that, it was a little hard for me to connect because I didn't know much about her, or I hadn't seen any of her work. They have done previous exhibitions on the work of Stanley Kubrick, Werner Herzog, David Lynch. So it's one of those where we'll just be keeping an eye on it, and we may talk about it again.
An eye on the Eye Museum.
And I will keep an eye on the Eye Museum. And they also have a movie theater there that shows a variety of both old and contemporary Dutch films, but also just films related to the exhibitions that are on tour there. They have a restaurant in the facility that you can dine in. We did not take advantage of that. Advantage. And then they had a gift shop, which we did take advantage of.
Yes, we did.
Ariana got herself a Log Lady pillow, so it's her log. And it was a deck of movie-themed tarot cards, because that goes along with a lot of the solo role-playing games. Some of them use tarot card decks. So I thought 2 in 1, we got it right here. But yeah, if you are ever in Amsterdam, Do not look me up. Don't contact me because I don't live in Amsterdam. I would say visit the iFilm Museum if movies are something that you're interested in. Well, that was the Pop Cult Podcast for this week. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and make sure to check out our show notes for links to reviews on popcult.blog for anything we might have talked about here. Also, check out popcult.blog if you can. We like to post on there every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and more things on the weekend, and there is a lot more to read over there than what we do here on the podcast. Make sure to subscribe wherever it is you do listen to this so that you'll be notified when our new episodes are up. If you do visit popcult.blog, you will notice that we are wrapping up our Comedy Masterworks series coming up this next week. We will be reviewing the movies Midnight Run, Waiting for Guffman, and The Big Lebowski to finish off that series. And then first week of April, we'll be starting our German New Wave series with Agir, Wrath of God, The Bitter Tears of Petra von Kant, and Alice in the Cities. Also, we have comic book reviews, television season reviews, and we've been doing some reviews on solo tabletop role-playing games recently, which I've been enjoying getting to discover those and play with them. Well, if you like any of this stuff, what we're doing here on the podcast, what we're doing over on popcult.blog, then we would encourage you to think about supporting us on Patreon. If you do support us on Patreon, there is additional podcast content that is currently available only for patrons. There are also different reward levels and goals that we're trying to reach, and I want to thank our patrons, Becca and Matt, for donating at the $10 Writers Room level. And at that level, one of their perks is they get to pick a movie once a month that I will watch and review. If you donate at that level or higher, you'll get to do the same. You can even add your own thoughts to the review if you would like. Well, until next time, keep listening.